Welcome to TDC and to this event that is co-sponsored by TDC, AIGA New York, and Design Incubation. So for all of the new faces out there, I'm Eris Sharon. I'm one of the co-chairs of Design Incubation, and I am also on the board of AIGA New York. So those are my two sort of volunteer hats, which I take on and off depending on our different events. So first of all, thank you all for coming out today. And a big welcome to those of you for whom it's your first Design Incubation TDC AIGA New York event. And welcome back. I see a lot of familiar faces, so it's really great to see all of you who have come to events and are coming back as well. That's sort of the best feedback that we can hope for. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of housekeeping announcements. And I'm just going to introduce you to the other Design Incubation chairs. And so after the panel discussion, feel free to come up and introduce yourselves to us if we don't know you already. Dan Wong is right here. He's not listening to music. He's actually helping us with the audio. Liz DeLuna. Hi. And Alex Gerard in back is just taken on helping us with peer review. So Dan and Liz, co-chairs of Design Incubation, and Alex is going to be, if you just do at some point decide to present at a colloquium, he is going to be manning the gates in terms of peer review. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about Design Incubation because the panel discussions really have originated from Design Incubation. There's some chairs over here, so feel free to come around and get yourself a chair. We haven't really started yet. All the way over here. Yep. So the goal of Design Incubation is to foster opportunities for faculty to assess both creative work and scholarship and research within communication design. And so Design Incubation came together just about 3 years ago now, a bunch of faculty from various New York City schools, New York City institutions of higher education, who felt siloed in our disciplines and siloed in our own institutions, and we were just sort of wondering what other folks were doing at other institutions. We realized that outside of spending a lot of time with the faculty that we knew very well at faculty meetings, et cetera, we didn't really know each other and know what we were working on. So Design Incubation started with a series of conversations where faculty were able to present their research and or some aspect of their teaching and to receive feedback from their peers. And since then, we've grown to also have a Design Educators Award. So we have an outside group of group who juries the awards in scholarship creative work, scholarship published research, teaching, and service. And that was sort of to answer the question of finding opportunities toward excellence in our field. And also, a lot of educators were saying, we do really meaningful, maybe community engagement projects and or really meaningful projects with our students. But when we look to competitions out there, that might be industry-based, we feel like we're up against an ad agency that might have a $500,000 budget or a $100,000 budget, and faculty didn't feel like they were necessarily competing on a level playing field. So the awards are sort of an answer to that feedback from faculty who are going through the tenure and promotion process. We also have a fellowship. So the Design Incubation Fellowship is a writing fellowship. That's educators from around the country come to New York for 3 days in January. It's a great time to come to New York, as we all know in January. The weather might not be great, but it is singularly the cheapest time of year to come to New York. So for faculty from around the country who don't have huge budgets, it's a great opportunity to come and work with editors, get some information from publishers, and actually workshop a piece of writing over 3 days. Then they commit to working on that project for another 6 months afterwards. And lastly, our signature event are the colloquiums. Some of you may have been to the colloquium. I see a few people who've actually presented at colloquium. So the colloquium were sort of where we got started with Design Incubation, where faculty present for 5 or 6 minutes some aspect of their teaching or research and receive feedback from their peers. For those of you who think you might be a little chilly come February, we encourage you to come out to CAA and submit to the colloquium in CAA in LA. That will be our next colloquium with Design Incubation CAA partnership, and then we'll probably have another one in the spring for those of you who don't feel like traveling all the way to LA. Liz, you have any things to say about TDC? We are so thankful that we're able to use this wonderful space that TDC has, and it's such a great space both for presentations but also, for having sort of a more intimate organic discussion. Doesn't feel like we're in a giant lecture hall, so we're so happy.
TDC has been really nice to
so
co-sponsor this with us. But TDC wants everyone to know that there is a competition, a TDC competition now, which is for both students, educators, professionals. There is a communication design competition and a typeface design competition. I'm not exactly sure when the deadline is. I think the final deadline is maybe January, but I think there are a bunch of pre-deadlines. It's a fantastic thing to enter if your work does get in the, it's a judged competition, and if your work does get entered and you win, you're in a show that travels around the world. You get into really one of the beautiful TDC books, and there are a bunch of them in front. It's a great thing to be part of. It's also great to be a member of TDC. Type Directors Club are really invested in education, which is partly why we're here, and there's tremendous programming here. So
for the competition, the work has to be type related, or?
Well, it's communication design. There's two. It's communication design and typeface design. So specifically typeface design. Or any kind of communication design.
That's great information. And the student one, for those of you who are educators and have all those students, that's a great opportunity to get students some recognition as well, right?
Absolutely. And then there's a show of all the work in the Llewellyn Gallery at Cooper Union. So the award winner's work is also in the show. Great.
So today you're here. Thanks for coming out again. Today's panel is really to talk about sort of the nuts and bolts, sort of where we as educators spend a lot of our time developing syllabi, developing assignments, and to a lesser extent thinking about curriculum. So this event actually came out of a previous panel event where people came up and talked to us about what they were interested in afterwards, and we heard from several people, hey, we're interested in talking about this thing of developing student projects, developing curriculum, all getting the opportunity to hear from a variety of voices around that. So as you looked at the panelists, you'll see that there's a wide variety of teaching experiences represented, and that's not an accident, right? That it's particularly in New York, I would hesitate to say probably 75% of faculty teaching communication design are teaching part-time and are full-time practitioners, right? And so we wanted to represent that. We have somebody, Alex Gerard was in administration briefly before he came back from the dark side and rejoined us as faculty. So he's going to be able to speak to that a little bit. We have longtime educators, Ned Drew and Debbie Millman. And Scott Santoro, he runs a creative practice, but teaching is part, informs his creative practice and vice versa. So we're looking to give voice to sort of the plurality of experiences that educators have and the richness that really brings to our discipline. I think, we wouldn't want to be in a situation where we didn't continue to have those ties of industry and have those varied perspectives. So that's part of how we're framing what you're going to be hearing about and what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to begin with each of our 4 panelists giving us a little bit of just a hint of what they do, what might make them different. It gives you a little bit of context so that as they're answering the questions during the panel, you can sort of see where they're coming from. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing the panelists, so I will ask each of the panelists to just introduce themselves by saying their institutional affiliation. And then we're going to move right into a moderated panel discussion, which Liz and I are going to lead. And after a while of that, we're going to open it all up to you because as all of you who are educators in the room are just as much experts as we are, and so we want the discussion to proceed in a more organic way after that. Okay? So without any further ado, Ned Drew, you're first up.
All right.
Thanks.
So yes, I'm Ned Drew, and I have been teaching at Rutgers for coming up on 23 years now. I head the program there. It's a small graphic design program. And I also am part of a new initiative called Express Newark, which is like an art incubator that we were lucky enough to have funding and facilities kind of thrust upon us. When talking to Liz and Arliss, they asked me to kind of talk about how I came to this point in my career, and it's been a strange career. When I first started at Rutgers, I felt very, very alone, very, very isolated. I was searching for ways to collaborate or to work with others. I had gone to graduate school where there was a robust conversation every day to Rutgers, and I just felt, as a state institution with a small design program, really, really alone. And what I tried to do, and I think that's kind of framed my career, is try to collaborate as much as possible with like-minded people or people that I find interesting or unique. So the whole idea of 1 + 1 = 3, which is a plagiarism I ripped off from Paul Rand and others, I really kind of believe in that, because for me, working by myself, again, can be kind of isolating. And when it comes time to actually collaborate with somebody, there's just a rush of ideas that I think are really, really fulfilling. When I was in graduate school, I actually went to graduate school with my brother, who's about 3 years older than I am. And it was kind of an interesting time, to say the very least. But when we both left, he was teaching at the University of Utah, and I was at Rutgers. We both were feeling that isolation. And what we tried to do, or what we thought was an interesting idea, was, well, there's got to be other people in this situation, and there's got to be other people that want to share these ideas about how they teach, what they teach, and the process. And so we kind of came up with a 10-volume idea of these journals, where we were soliciting other professors to kind of share in detail their briefs, their methodology, their approach, and their process. If any of you have ever worked with siblings, you know that it can be kind of a difficult thing. So after 3, it kind of fizzled out for various other reasons. But it was a great experience, because I met so many people in the process, and really got to understand. You see all the time in books, you see, well, the end result, but what we were trying to do is just kind of unearth that process and that approach. I actually wrote for the journal itself, had an opportunity, and one of kind of the unique things about this was in our discussions, this idea of making lemonade out of lemons. So I felt isolated, and I felt as though I was unsure of myself as a young professor, and I was looking for opportunities, and it kind of it dawned on me that the opportunities were right in front of you. And I think I've said this several times, and I think it's really true. You learn more from your students than your students learn from you. And we have a very, very diverse population of kids, and well, not kids, young adults. And so the project that I kind of was working on and generated in that context was just a currency project, but it really could have been a poster series or any. I like working in multiples of 3 so they can kind of expand a system. But the currency project was, I asked the students to kind of think about a country that they had some sort of ownership about the information. A lot of them are first, second generation, or maybe the first to go to college in their family. And so, you know, they could continuously interview family and friends. They didn't have to, but it was to their advantage. And so the currency project kind of came out of that. And they would go through a series of, these are just spreads from the book, and go through a series of notations and investigations. And this is just another example. So this would be, normally this is in graphic design 3, maybe graphic design 2, depending. I can kind of shift it around depending upon the students. I think this project kind of inspired me to do my own interpretation. These are actually letterpress, but these were kind of my thinking behind reevaluating the currency. And what I've noticed, I think, is as I progressed, is that I keep on going back to the same things. There's tools that I use for my students that I think is valuable for them in the future. How they can use these when they're ideating or thinking of mind maps and other things. And these are kind of matrices identifying different types of images and their use. This is kind of a cheat sheet of visual possibilities. We talk about contrast being a really important part. We talk about just how many different ways there are to actually generate images. And then something like this would come out of this graphic design too. And then I don't even really talk about it as a poster or a book cover or anything like that. We're working with the information that they've gathered. They've created these relationships, either formal or conceptual. And again, it's if I take the application out of it, I tend to come back to these this kind of cheat sheet or these kind of matrices again and again and again. They're very important to me because I think, you know, when all's said and done, it's the kind of those tools or those ways of thinking that are most important for the student in the future. And then real quickly, the last thing we have, this is the Express Newark before it's much messier and interesting now, but we have 2 Vandercooks, and what I'm trying to do now in terms of the curriculum is I'm actually falling back into Graphic Design 1, Graphic Design 2, the lower level classes, and I'm going to try to get my Graphic Design 1 students on the presses themselves so they can start talking about, you know, what letting really is and things like that, kind of basic terminology. When I was teaching Graphic Design 1 in the past, it's very, very abstract, it's very, very difficult to teach. Points and picas are a weird kind of vocabulary and approach. So when we're on the presses themselves, it will kind of relate more. That's it.
I hide in the back because I'm kind of tall and don't want to block any of your views of the screen. And forgive my garish orange, but Halloween is coming and I couldn't resist the opportunity. So my name is Alex Gerard. I'm an assistant professor of graphic design at Southern Connecticut State University. We're up in New Haven, and I'm also the program lead for graphic design at the university. First, I think it's important to understand some context about myself. So who am I as a design educator? I see design education as experiential design, so we are crafting an experience for students to navigate to an intended outcome. My intended outcome for my student experience is for them to develop their own visual voices. So I don't have a convergent approach to design education. I don't want all of my students to come to the program and then leave the program designing in a very specific way. I want each of them to develop the best visual voice they have. And then on top of that, people often ask when I'm new to Southern Connecticut State University, they ask, so where are you from? And oftentimes I have to take this deep breath because it is a very long answer. And so I thought it best to provide you all the visual, as we are visual thinkers. But the black line represents my path as a kid following my father's career, and then I have had to follow a similar path in my career. I have this bad habit of following an interesting opportunity and not always checking on a map where that opportunity will lead me. And I oftentimes think it's sort of a fun first date icebreaker, but it seems to alarm people because I keep going on first dates. So I may have to do some self-evaluation and change my method there. But from an educational standpoint, this really shapes my perspective and experience. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened to me in Colorado. I started my academic career as a faculty member in the Colorado Community College system, and once I navigated their tenure process, I was actually given the opportunity to serve as an associate dean. So as an associate dean, in orange are the departments that I help to oversee. And if you're able to find a theme there, you're a better person than I. We were the School of Professional Studies and Sciences, or the departments the school didn't know how to cluster. And my primary charge in that role was coordinating curriculum across multiple campuses and many, many different sites. And we found that the best way to do that was through assessment models. So what is assessment? Assessment is simply measuring outcomes. And it was our charge to make sure that someone who's taking Intro to Accounting at both campuses and 10 sites is having a similar experience. And the best way to demonstrate that is through an assessment model. And I had this was a really exciting experience because all of a sudden I was able to tap all of these different thinkers on how they were looking at assessment and how they were demonstrating outcomes and how they were engaging students. And I thought to myself, wow, as a faculty member in design, I was really resisting assessment because it seemed like this thing that was imposed on me after the fact by our accrediting agencies and administration. But it's really this beneficial thing to demonstrate value and demonstrate what you're doing. And so it is something I am now thinking a lot as a design educator. So I've segued back into graphic design. If you see here, I was overseeing departments and graphic design was not in there. So I missed design education. So how are we looking at assessment? There's two primary things that I think you want to break apart assessment. And that is the method, so that's how. So how are you measuring an outcome? Most educators will follow some sort of rubric. So this is sort of an expected approach. I usually do a 5-tier model, and then you can have categories. And what that allows, especially students early in their education, is to see that design isn't just this gut reaction. I like this end result. They're able to see that you can have concept and hierarchy and typography and all of those things working together to create an end result, but they're actually isolated components. Something I found that was really interesting to me when I was working with multiple the departments is that where is your baseline for success? Many students are coming to education from a culture of you have a graduation ceremony in kindergarten and then a graduation ceremony in first grade and then you have a graduation ceremony when you go to middle school, and there's this constant reward process. And so a lot of students are aiming for an A or a high mark, but it's important as an educator to have a discussion on, so if you just cross the finish line, where do you land? And then how do you map to success beyond that? So that's what I'm talking about here in terms of your baseline versus something that is aspirational. And you can do that through a rubric. The more exciting thing to me is the model of assessment. So not how you're measuring something, but who you're measuring, what you're measuring, when you're measuring, where, and why are you measuring these things. So I put two pretty traditional assessment models up here. In orange, I'm indicating an assessment point, so when you are measuring an outcome. In design education, most of the assessment models I experienced and I hear educators use are these top two. We have an end result, and we measure it in some way. That's the top one. So we're focused on the end product. And then some educators give benchmark points along the way. You check in when you do your sketches, you check in when you have your versions, and so on. And this is great if the only thing you ever want your students to learn is project-based. But there's a lot of times in design education, we are wanting to develop soft skills or develop process. And I think it's important to develop assessment models beyond these expected ones. For instance, as a design educator, you are oftentimes talking about process. Process is important, process is important. But if you're only measuring the end product, your students might have a hard time seeing the reward of developing a process if that process isn't rewarded with points. So I took a very accessible logo. Okay, so if you're doing a logo project, and I wanted to just demonstrate to you all that the project, while important, you can develop multiple assessment models to make sure that whatever you want your end result to be, you are measuring at the time. So this bottom, so we have our two expected assessment models here, but I've developed some others. My art historian colleagues are constantly telling me my designers can't write. So you can, around a logo project, develop a writing project. And so they are, yes, designing a logo, but you are reinforcing good writing by measuring their writing outcomes. So maybe they're doing a research statement, a project brief, a designer statement, and a self-evaluation. Or along here, when I'm wanting to reinforce process, I pull out points related to the end product, and instead points are only given throughout the process of the project. And then the last one is there's no greater groan you'll hear in class than around we're going to do a group work assignment. And oftentimes I'm talking to students, so why do you hate your group work? And they say, because you're measuring the end product, but everyone, I did more and they did less and they never showed up. So there's all of this hesitation because the focus is on the end product. But if you're wanting them to learn about collaboration and group work, why not develop an assessment model that is assessing and reinforcing the act of the group work? So there you could actually have your assessment points between your deliverables around what is happening in the classroom and that sort of collaboration. So, and the reason I care about this and think it's really exciting is if we are engaged in the dialogue, we are leading it rather than responding to it, and we're enforcing practice in the classroom. So assessment's pretty exciting.
So hi everybody, my name is Debbie Millman and I'm the chair of the Masters in Branding program at the School of Visual Arts. And rather than talk specifically about a project, although I will talk a little bit about projects, I thought I would talk to you about the project of making this whole department and this whole program, because this was the first Masters in Branding program that has ever been created in the world. And so I thought it would be interesting to tell you how it happened and some of the challenges that we faced as we were putting this together. So back in 2007, Steve Heller wrote me a very sort of innocuous email asking me if I wanted to have lunch. That was it. And we had lunch regularly, but this one had a little bit more mystery associated with it. I met him. And he told me that in addition to working on the launch of the interaction department that he had been involved in and the products of design master's program, he asked if I would be interested in starting a master's in branding program. And he said I didn't need to answer him right away, that I could spend some time thinking about it. And I was like, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, yes. At the time, I was also the president of a branding consultancy called Sterling Brands, but we were about to be acquired by Omnicom, and I knew that I'd have probably a 3-year contract that I'd have to fulfill, and thought, oh, this is going to be the most amazing thing to do for the rest of my life. And so Steve said that it would take quite a lot of time to put together. It would not be something that I would be paid for, but obviously if it was accepted, then I would have a job for the rest of my life. So we set about putting together an entire curriculum that I had to make from scratch. And because I was doing this sort of on my own time, in my own way, I didn't have any faculty, I didn't have any money to pay any faculty. So essentially, what I did was put together a program that I would have wanted to take when I was learning about branding sort of in situ, on the job in the various consultancies that I'd worked at over the years. And it was an incredible opportunity to put together a sort of fantasy program. What would I want to learn if I was starting out as a brand consultant or a brand designer or a brand manager? And so I went about putting this together. It took 3 years. What was interesting was it didn't quite represent a Venn diagram of being able to have sort of one life, one work life, and then another work life begin. I did have quite a few years in the middle where I was doing both, but that helped inspire the way in which I organized the program. So I'll talk a little bit about that. The one thing that I can tell you is that we were, the biggest obstacle that we faced in putting this program together was the fact that I don't have a terminal degree in branding. But the way we were able to get around that was, well, until this program, there was no terminal degree in branding. And so despite the fact that I don't have a master's degree, I am teaching and running a master's program in branding. So every year now that it's been 8 years, every year that my students graduate, I tell them that they have the one thing in branding that I don't have, which is a master's degree in branding. So we set up the program. I talked a little bit about I didn't talk about the accreditation. So we set this up. So it's a School of Visual Arts, but yet it's more of a business program than it is a design program. And so the programs at SVA have a lot of different accreditations. We have obviously the Department of Education, but one that we didn't have one that I didn't get was the NASED. We're not an art program. And so we were actually rejected from NASAD because of the amount of business in my program. And so the provost asked me if I wanted to tweak my program at all because he thought it would mean a lot to me to have the NASAD accreditation, but actually I think it's a bit of a badge to not have it. And I didn't want to change the program and make it less of a business program because I felt like that was what the students need. And so having this accreditation would not really provide anything for me. It would actually detract from what kind of curriculum I could put together. So it's a one-year program. It's 36 credits, and it is really, really intense. I was very specifically instructed not to make it so intense, but there was absolutely no way, and I still struggle with being able to run a program about branding in 10 and a half months. It's almost impossible to do. One of the things, because I had a day job and because this was going to be a one-year program, I was encouraged to make it a night program. So originally it was supposed to be Monday through Thursday, with Friday and the weekend giving the students an opportunity to sort of recharge. I couldn't do it. The program is Monday through Friday, 6:30 to 9 o'clock in the fall. And then in the spring, from January to May, I actually added a Saturday program, which is optional. So the students actually have to apply to that. We call it an honors program. And that's when they have an opportunity to work with any number of real clients. We get a lot of calls to rebrand different, mostly pro bono organizations, nonprofit organizations, which we do all this pro bono for them. But the students have to apply to be able to show that they can manage their workload. And so we generally get about half the students apply to that, and that's a Saturday program. And then in the thesis semester, so we're a 3-semester program, it's all thesis 24/7. So it's structured around working professionals. We get a lot of people that do work during the day. They work till 5:30, have their dinner break, and then come to class and start at 6:30 and go through 9. So it's 5 nights a week. Unlike Alex, our program is all collaborative learning. So branding is not a individual sport. You don't, very rarely does somebody get hired to do a big global branding program and do it on their own. It's just not possible. There's so many different facets of branding that it is very much a team sport. So the students are grouped into teams. They have a team in the fall, a team in the spring, and a team in thesis. And so they have individual projects over the course of the year. In fact, they have a 100-day project that I help them with and run, where they have to do something on their own every day for 100 days. But all of the other projects that they do for the classwork is in groups, because branding is a group dynamic, and because there's so much politics in corporate branding, as you can well imagine, you get a bit of a microcosm of what it's like to actually have to collaborate, have to compromise, and have to co-create. So almost all of our work is collaborative learning. And then this is the work that we do in the different disciplines. Branding, I often say branding is not it's not a result. It's not a journey, it's a result. You have to take a whole series of steps on that journey to have something that results in a brand. So the brand is the result. There really is no such thing as branding. The discipline is a combination of these disciplines, so cultural anthropology, behavioral psychology, economics, finance, ergonomics, design, positioning, market research, and strategy. So that's why you could see we didn't get approved by NASAD. And so this is what we are teaching, a broad understanding of topics taught in leading MBA programs, but with a more creative, multidisciplinary perspective. And so we often get people that are choosing between going to get an MBA or coming to get a master's degree in branding, and they tend to end up coming to us because we are multidisciplinary. You're getting much more than just an MBA. You're getting a broad understanding of MBA programs and what's taught in MBA programs, but it's much deeper. So we critically investigate brand, business, marketing, and design strategy, create frameworks to guide brand design and business development, to gain an understanding of the brand development life cycle. How do you start from nothing and create something? Investigate the challenges involved in creating and sustaining brands. We do a lot of work in cultural anthropology and behavioral psychology and have PhDs in our program that are teaching both. We do a lot of work in understanding trends, understanding how to be able to understand what's happening from a position of zeitgeist, and then how that translates into predictive methodologies about human behavior. We have a woman who's a very senior person at Procter & Gamble who teaches the classic P&G methodology. She's been given approval by P&G to do that. She's been in our program. She actually worked, she hired us, didn't really hire us, she asked us if we could work on a project for our first thesis. Which was almost like striking gold. You know, Procter & Gamble comes to you and says, can you help us with a project for your thesis? And it's year one. And I'm like, okay, that gives us immediate credibility. And then since then, she's part of our faculty and now teaches a class on brand management. And then engage in C-level discourse, understand financial frameworks, brand valuation, how to read the Wall Street Journal. They're all required to read the Wall Street Journal every day. And I know we only are supposed to talk for 5 minutes, so I'll go through. This is our fall semester, so origins of consumer markets, brand identities and package design, a unified theory of branding, which is more corporate-based, the meaning of branded objects, and that's by Dr. Tom Goriello, a clinical psychologist, the business of branding, and brand failures, which is really important to understand, you know, what makes a brand fail. And then for anybody that wants, our full curriculum is on our website at the sva.org, .edu website. If you just type in branding, you'll find it. And then in spring, brand physics. We have a client that comes on board. We've been working with Bayer for the last 4 years. They sponsor a scholarship for us, and last year we repositioned how hemophilia is talked about in the marketplace, and this year we're going to do a project on diabetes. Tuesdays, because it's really hard for me to be able to fit in everything that we need to do in this program, we have 3 5-week classes. We have one of our students graduated, one of our alum from year 2 graduated and is now at Interbrand as a senior strategist, and he's working with the CMO, and they teach the students how to pitch business. Kenna Kay works on the power of persuasion, and Ken Carbone teaches the students visual systems. Dr. Dan Formosa, this is our ergonomics and market research class. Sam Devilart, looks like her thing somehow has disappeared, but she teaches predictive methodologies in branding. And then I teach a class called A Brand Called You, which is about a 100-day project. And this is about how to introduce the students to being able to talk about branding in a meaningful way in the community. And then our thesis, we have been working on repositioning brands that have fallen out of pace with culture for the most part. We work with real brands, not as clients. We just pick clients that we pick brands that we believe need to be repositioned. Although last year we did for the first time ever one project, and that was repositioning essentially repositioning America. And how do we think about what's going on in this world right now and in our country? So this is generally the thesis. And then this is a sample honors program. We worked last year. Vinood and Neru Khosla. Vinood Khosla is the founder of Sun Microsystems, and his daughter took the program in year 6. And he became very interested in what we were doing, and they run a foundation. Vinood, so he's no longer, he founded Sun Microsystems, but he's no longer working there. He has a VC company, and his wife runs a foundation, which is called CK12, which is essentially giving classroom materials to educational institutions all over the world for free. They don't fundraise. They just pay for it all and send it out. And so they needed a new identity and a new position in the marketplace, and we worked with them. And so I'll just read this because it's probably hard to read, and then I'll finish up. CK12's co-founder, Nera Khosla, and Tyler Basmani are out to save the American public school system, and they're doing it with free software and tools. The CK12 Foundation creates both customizable content and tools, from textbooks to videos to interactive simulations, and gives them away for free to millions of students. The organization hires teachers to develop materials that fit state standards, and districts can also use the platform to produce their own digital resources. More than 100,000 teacher-created digital textbooks are now available online through the CK12 Foundation's free STEM content and tools platform. The Khosla Honors Program initiatives are as follows. And so this is our honors program, this was the criteria that we set forth for the students to help the CK12 organization. Assist the Khosla Foundation in reviewing, reaffirming, and/or revising CK12's strategic mission and positioning in the world of primary and secondary education. Review alignment of CK12's current execution touch points with current and potential future mission and strategic positioning. develop a rich array of alternative touch points that best express the CK12 org brand's mission and positioning, recommend prioritize changes to strengthen the brand's ability to successfully execute its strategy and touch points to fulfill its mission, and recommend prioritize changes to strengthen the brand's ability to successfully execute its strategy and touch points to fulfill its mission, including an alternative architecture for the website. So this is what the group of students, it was about 5 students, did for this particular. We have 4 different honors programs for the spring semester. So 5 students work with 2 faculty and a TA to essentially redo this in about 16 weeks. So it's pretty amazing. So that's the branding program. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Scott Santoro, adjunct with a semi-tenured position at Pratt Institute, where I went to school. It's a labor of love. I have a practice as well. I like to tell my relatives that I teach at Pratt for the free parking that I get in the parking lot. But I'm lying. I actually pay $200 a year for that parking. I kind of straddle a number of schools, a triptych of schools. I started off at Pratt. I worked for 5 years at Landor in Mobile, and then I went to and in between I went on this summer program with Yale called Brizago program, where I had Paul Rand and Armin Hoffman and Wolfgang Weingart and Herbert Matter as teachers for a week each. And then I went to Cranbrook. After working for 5 years, I had enough. I went to graduate school to Cranbrook, and it all kind of came together for me there. This is my card, work site. I tried to register this name and trademark the name, work site, and they said, well, send us an example, and I sent that, and they said, oh, that's not good enough, and they rejected me because they said it just says work, and I said, no, it says, work site, vision, and it says work site, over here, and they're like, it's not good enough. So I got into trouble for being creative on my business card. But this kind of comes from what I found, what I had inside me is my own personal brand. Debbie's talking about branding me or branding yourself, and I really did brand myself early on. I came from a family of plumbers. My uncles, my cousins, they were all plumbers. And I was apprenticed to be a plumber. And at some point, my parents said, you need to go to college. We don't want you to be a plumber. And I said, well, the only thing I knew how to do was art. And they said, then go to art school. So I did. I started incorporating, this is like a sophomore project where it was for the solidarity movement, and I used a pipe wrench. Like that was the raw material that I knew well, and that's what I just mindlessly built into my work, and other things like that. I eventually, when I went to Cranbrook, I took back a plumbing manual because we were going to work on redefining what a book should look like, and I took a Freud book and a plumbing manual, combined the two, but and made one book out of the two books. But the plumbing manual, I realized, there's so much rich imagery in this book that I just started throwing it into my free assignments, like the Fine poster, which was a Valentine's Day party poster that had this kind of find in lounge coded message. And they said the theme was that everyone was going to get wet. That they were going to have buckets of water. Everybody's going to get wet. I thought, oh my God, this is perfect. The stars have aligned. So I did that poster, and I got, the posters the year before was like cupids and everything, and I could bring something else into my work. And I remember two sculptors, who were these really, they were like the tough guys, who were working with torches and everything. They shook my hand and they said, wow, you did that poster. It was a giant silk screen that just screened. And they said, that's really cool. We really like that. And I thought, okay, I got acknowledgement from the fine artists that always look down on designers and the program. So I knew I was onto something. And other examples of plumbing imagery, but just as a structural metaphor to look through and to sort of jokingly add as a myth that it has something to do with me. And then I realized it does have something to do with me. It's so obvious. It became a way, a lens to kind of see the world through, a tough aesthetic. My father builds systems in the walls. I design systems in the mind. Blue collar, defeat of kind of like my white collar profession, my conceited white collar profession. That, you know, that I like blue collar kind of language kind of intruding into, just to challenge it. And then I named my company Worksite because of that, as an homage to my family trade. And a lot of personal promotions came out of that, using industrial images, parts. These are a series of 4 tiny brochures with parts hanging off of them, things like that. You know, I perpetuated it, but I started getting, and even holiday cards over the last 30 years that play with that imagery, and boxes of tools that, you know, relatives would bring down to do a job, fix a toilet or something, and I'd be there with my camera recording it, you know, just to gain this kind of extra raw material. But it led to work that, you know, work for factories, because, you know, somebody would have this client and they'd say, you know, Scott, you'd be perfect for this. And it would be to like create a capabilities brochure, in this case for a Tubular Steel furniture manufacturer in North Carolina. And, you know, they brought me in and I looked around. I designed the logo to start with, and they said, you know, we want to really clean this place up. You know, we want to have white sheets around everything. We want to shoot the furniture and the manufacturing process. And I'm like, no, please don't do that. This is an authentic, real place, and why not just be honest? So we shot everything. The photographer was the wedding photographer for the owner's son, and so I had to use him. But he really brought like a fashion chic to the factory. So the whole brochure, 32-page piece, shows people working, objects, rubbings off of tubular steel that just got incorporated into the brochure, and this beautiful furniture shot while it's being made, and people could tell that it was. I mean, the company needed a full binder catalog, but this kind of set a personality and a tone for them. And as soon as they came out with it, Noel offered to buy them, so it kind of worked. Although they were a little worried about it, but when it came out, they were very happy. And I also do things like, I mean, this was a redesign of a poster for a business agent running for a pipe fitters union, bringing graphic design to that, just to keep it fresh for me. This was one of a series of 5 Gilbert promotions where I did the same thing, where I was asked to go in and create a piece about the 100-year-old paper mill, and I realized, you know, this is a gritty, tough, but really beautiful, authentic place, and they let me do this again with this, which turned into a series of promotions based on American subcultures. So when I was there, I realized this is a subculture. The workers are called the Gilbert Ducks because of their baseball team, because there's a giant duck pond in front of their factory. I saw this hook lying around. I picked it up off the floor, and I realized, you know, the hook is functional, but it's also beautiful, and it kind of looks like a duck. And I put the ducks on the cover, and the factory, and the flag, and, you know, I called it Honest Beauty Gilbert Paper. But the way I sold it was how I got to intellectualize design through my training in grad study, which was, I could say, you know, it looks this way for a reason. It's authentic, and also the signs that I'm using, the duck. Because they said the same thing. They didn't want to shoot in the factory. They didn't want to include these people because they're not good looking and all this stuff. And I said, you know, this is the Hans Christian Andersen story. I don't see this mill as an ugly place. I see this as or an ugly duckling. I see it as a beautiful swan, and I want to shoot it that way and treat it that way. So that duck or swan led the concept that drove the whole piece, amongst other rationales like finding a symmetry in this chaos of the mill. But it also applies to things like I did this brochure and logo for MoMA, and they said, well, we're looking for some definitive image for a glyph or a mark and to start the piece off as a brochure. And they had this ball bearing, and I said, why not use the ball bearing? That's like your first collected piece for this architecture and design department. So that's what I use. So it's not just plumbing imagery and factories, it's also like an attitude to take. Just like Mahoney Nash says, design is not just a profession, it's an attitude. And it became my attitude to take. So this kind of training and profession gets built into a lot of the kinds of projects that I teach and give. So these are two senior projects. I call it the myth poster. So they have to find something in their background, something that they know really well or that they care about or what their parents do, and create a poster that explains that somehow. So in this case, on the left is Andy. He said he, for like a decade, sat in the back of his parents' van and sold like just used items, shoes, and he could convince anybody to buy like an old tie or an old shoe, but it gave him a certain attitude to take towards design, and he created this piece as his myth poster that says everything ties, and he explains his story and as to how he understands how to sell a design and all of that. The piece on the right is just a student just said my backstory, but her backstory included the study of mathematics. She was a math major, and she brought that kind of imagery to her poster, her myth poster. Just to create something inventive that has a backstory to it, and that it looks good, seems to me at least. But it's for them. It's to feed them for their career, to become perpetual students. I also recently started giving a lot of more political projects. So, I mean, this is one I gave last year, and I gave it again, the Flint, Michigan crisis. So I asked students to do a little bit of writing, research about Flint. Where I went to grad school was just outside of, near Flint, Michigan. And, these two pieces are, they're cherry picked, but they really get into showing some of the research and emotion. Like this is 151 because that's how many bottles a family of 4 has to go through every single day in Flint right now. And she made a giant F with these crushed plastic bottles. So, getting that emotion and that resonance from the viewer based on her research, I thought, okay, A. And the same with the giant crushing ball of, drip of dirty water with Flint kind of distressed in there, and this empathetic creature about to be crushed by it. So the things that they maybe didn't care about, but when they researched it, they did care about it, just from knowing about it. And I think that's pretty important in not just teaching. Paul Rand said every design education, it was up at that show that they had. Design education should be both theoretical projects and practical projects. And I do teach practical projects, but I also teach theoretical projects. Projects that they have to intellectualize what they're doing, why it looks the way it looks, etc. Last thing, I actually, this culminated into a textbook that I wrote a few years ago. It took me 5 years to write for Pearson. They asked me to do it, write it, and of course I had to design it, and the answer was no. And I did this cover, and they said, oh, we love it. It's a crit wall. It's got some push pins in it.
Mm-hmm.
They said, we love it. It show up well on Amazon's little 1.5 inch tall item. And they said, but you have to take the arrow off. And I said, so the practical part of me said, okay, well, I do want them to improve the cover, but the theoretical part said, no, I want a cover that I'm proud of. And so I said, I can't take the arrow off, period. Or I have to start a new cover. And they said, well, explain to the director of Pearson why. And I said, because it's type, image, and graphic. And that's the triptych of things that we work with. Type, image graphic. And also the arrow is over the word to, and it's guide to. So I explained how it all made sense, and that's where the theoretical part, the training in me, was able to bring words to convince them. And they said, okay. So we got printed. So that's it. Thanks.
So we'd like to invite our panelists up to the front now. We're going to just shut down the computer. I don't know about all of you, but hearing all these different perspectives just is super inspiring. It gives me all sorts of ideas for things to bring back to my own classroom, just from what we've heard so far. Okay.
That's okay.
Okay, so now we're gonna take some time and get into some of the meat of the questions. Liz, did you want to start?
I just wanted to say I have a couple of books here. You guys probably can't see them, but this is one of Ned's books, number 2 from the series, which was part of the inspiration from this whole thing. So these are 3 books. This is another book called Taking a Line for a Walk. Assignments in Design Education, which is also a great design education project book, and Draw It With Your Eyes Closed, which is a little more towards art school, but a great book by Paper Monument. But there is one thing that's, Ned has a really lovely introduction in the book that I thought was a really nice way to speak to design education and the importance of it, and part of the wording is, at a variety of professional design conferences I recently attended, I heard several designers, art directors, and creative directors comment that effective communication and design appear to be dead. My concern is that these professions do not realize that effective conceptual methodology, great visualization, message making, and writing skills within graphic design are not taught in many colleges and universities because it is so difficult to find educators who know how to teach these skills. Where does this leave our profession? So just speaking to the importance of our responsibility teaching design and teaching design students. So I think it's great that you made this book, and Abby Goldstein from Fordham, who could not be here, said that she's been using this book to structure her classes and curriculum at Fordham for years. So
I don't remember that at all.
yeah, I know.
So I was wondering, we've had each of you sort of talk a little bit about your backgrounds, but there's, we're a discipline that's very much tied to industry, and Debbie talked about how even it's sort of a badge not to be able to get NASA accreditation because that she was really looking out for what she wanted these group of students that she was going to work with and preparing them for this very specific place. And I'm just wondering, like, if each of you can talk a little bit about that, where that connection to industry and how important that continues to be for your teaching, particularly for some of you, also think about like people who end up in education long term after 8 years, right? I mean, it's a little bit different than when you first come straight from industry. So, Debbie, why was it attractive? First of all, why was that like the 3-second yes, right? I mean, as somebody who's working in industry, what made you excited about that opportunity? And then how do you continue to see that sort of connection with yourself and your other faculty to industry playing into how the program is structured?
Good question. I had already been teaching undergrad.
Oh, okay.
And I've been teaching undergrad at SVA probably since 2003, 2004, thereabouts. I don't remember the exact year. But it's interesting with what Liz just read in the comment. The reason that I was invited to teach at SVA was because I was going to be teaching the students essentially. I'll just tell you what the title of my class is: Differentiate or Die, How to Get a Job When You Graduate. So, and I have found and continue to find that students are woefully unprepared to get jobs when they graduate from their undergraduate education. And they will show their portfolios and talk about how much they love this or why they decided to do that with the type, and don't talk about what the benefit of hiring them is, don't talk about what they can uniquely bring to any environment, don't realize that they're going to be getting paid money to do this thing that they have learned how to do and ostensibly love to do, but in return have to have some sort of a return on the investment for getting that money. And they don't know how to write resumes, and they don't know how to really put together a job portfolio, which is very different from a portfolio that you'll show at a portfolio show at the Art Directors Club or something like that. And so I loved, and I still do it. When I got to when I got the opportunity to do the graduate program, Richard Wild at SVA assumed that I would stop teaching undergrad, but it's one of my favorite things to do. And I really feel that almost more than anything else I do, I'm able to influence these young people and potentially help shape the arc of their careers. So that's the big issue that I have, because I see this everywhere. I mean, I go to schools and teach and do workshops all over the world, and it is terrifying to see how unprepared undergraduate students are to go into the workplace and think that they're going to get a job because they're a people person. and so that's that.
Yeah.
Why I said yes immediately was because I was already well into my 40s and was getting really itchy to do something new. I'd been working in branding for over 30 years and loved teaching, and here was something that I didn't even envision was going to be possible for me, to create something that hadn't been ever made before. I mean, there are other lots of other advertising programs that include branding, but up until our program, there was no degree in branding. Now there are several. So it was a no-brainer. And I basically, I mean, not to make light of the situation, but I'll basically do anything Steve Heller recommends. So, he's been one of the few people in my life that has been not only a teacher, but a mentor.
Yeah,
So.
that's great to hear. Alex, I wonder if you can speak to this as I'm thinking about that crazy map you had up there, and you're traveling around, and how one of the things that we've found going out to different places around the country with Design Incubation is that the connection to industry, particularly here in New York, where the feedback loop is like 30 seconds, like somebody leaves your program and then they're working here in New York, tends to be very short, can be really different, and that can affect the whole idea of industry and students going into industry can be really different in other parts of the country. And you've had some experience in your travel to get to Southern Connecticut, so I wonder if you could speak to that aspect of it.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of where I have lived has maybe not been a cultural hub like New York is, and so it has also been interesting that I have now lived so many places that oftentimes I have goal where my students are now, where they are wanting to live and work is somewhere I have lived in the past. And so I'm really lucky in that I do have this very broad network, and sometimes when I'm not plugged into the local scene that I'm in, so I'm very new to Connecticut, I don't know a lot of designers in Connecticut, but I will bring in art directors that I know from Denver to come speak to the class. And so I think it hopefully is interesting for my students to see design beyond just the local perspective.
And Scott, you know, again, we talk about like a zero feedback loop. You're out there running your own, studio. How are you bringing that into the experience that you give your students at Pratt?
Well, I tell them I am giving them practical assignments to get that first job.
Yeah.
And then I'm also giving them theoretical projects, handouts that force them to intellectualize, and in order to keep that job.
Okay.
And they get that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's this we're all suffering from the key phrase disruptive innovation, and programs have been like scrambling to keep up with every new innovation that just totally warps what came before, and now it just driverless cars are about to come upon us, and that's going to be a big, serious thing. So yeah, we're always scrambling to reconfigure. And Pratt just went through a whole new curriculum change where we're compressing classes we're creating hybrid classes where like type and information design is now one big class so that they can cross-pollinate each other instead of type 1, type 2, type 3. Our sophomore class, which was called Visual Communications, is now called Image as Communication. And we get a series of speakers that come in that talk about how they use images to communicate. But the class is also really heavy on research and writing. And I really liked what you said about giving credit to students in the research part for them to understand that it's valuable, and if they don't do it, then they're going to get a lousy grade in the end. And it never occurred to me. I'm always asking students to just research, and then I can tell when they didn't, and then I mark them. But I have to find some rubric to mark them in the research part. Like I need to look at their notes and carefully examine them, which is a pain in the ass.
It is.
So yeah, I don't know.
Okay, great. Ned, do you have any specifics on that? 'Cause you're especially with you have a demographic of students who largely first generation to college, you said?
Yeah,
right?
and I think I'm answering the question when I say the most important thing that I've done in the last 10 years is kind of realize where I am in my career. When I first started, I was the junior faculty. I was probably a little bit more contemporary, was working more, was practicing more, was either working or working for myself. You know, I'm getting long in the tooth and I'm getting older now, and most of the projects I work on are self-initiated, so it's not fair for me to be in those advanced level classes. And in fact, I think we kind of talked about this. I'm gravitating towards the basic classes and finding that they are more interesting than I ever dreamed of. And so I think it's my responsibility as the program coordinator. I hired two really great junior faculties, Jennifer Bernstein and Chantel Fishing, who I met when I was teaching at Pratt. And they're really taking those classes, those advanced level classes, digital classes, and design for social change and other things. And I'm finding my place. You know, I'm kind of reverse engineering, going back to the beginning. And I think that's important to realize. If you don't, then I am kind of a dinosaur in some respects, but I'm smart enough to know where I can contribute. And I think that's, in those basic level classes.
Yeah, it's interesting because I also think, we have this idea of connecting to folks who are out there teaching in industry. As an educator, I feel, and Liz and I talk a lot about this, I'm such a better teacher, right? Having done it for almost 15 years. And so there's always this give and take, right? That's why it's great to have a diverse faculty in terms of their experience, because there's things that I'm able to do as an educator, and we've talked about this, we're able to do as an educator with that experience today, having taught for so many years, that I just didn't know to do in my first few years. But in my first few years, I had all this enthusiasm and about other things. So it's really just a continual evolution.
Well, I think sometimes we don't realize how difficult teaching is and how much of an art it is. I mean, I feel like, yes, I went to graduate school, I have a master's degree, I am qualified to teach, but I really didn't learn to teach until I started teaching. And I really didn't learn how to break down language until I started teaching in a school where students were not really visually cultured. And I think the kind of institutions we teach in and the kind of student bodies that we have really affect the teaching. And there's also different kinds of considerations of, yes, where it's a professional discipline, but the students are going to land in different places depending on where we're teaching them and what we're teaching them.
I have a question for Debbie. So the graduate program sounds incredibly rigorous, and you say that in the real world you work collaboratively. So how do you have the students represent the work that they do? When they get out, like, is it in their portfolio? Is it in their resume? Is there an end product that kind of tells a story? And how do they take ownership of whatever it is that they did in the program?
Well, they have opportunities in different scenarios to work on and contribute in different ways. So they might be working as the lead researcher in one project or the person who is putting together the materials and the presentation, but everything, there's a very strong focus on presentation. So they are all very much constantly needing to defend their work. And so even when they defend their thesis, they are all expected to be able to answer any question that anybody asks them about the project. So whereas in a more traditional branding environment, whether it be a corporate or a consultancy, you tend to have one or maybe two roles. While they're working in the program, they're constantly putting on a different and experiencing a different role so that they could be as multidisciplinary as possible with a lead gene toward market research or a lead gene toward design or marketing or any specific area that they're hoping to go into. Most of the students are looking to do something more strategic. The students tend to go in what is now, after 8 years, I could say with sort of some statistical significance, one of four areas, either in corporate design, in brand consulting, so they go to a brand consultancy, to creating their own brands. So quite a few of them have actually started and developed their own brands. And now what we're seeing, which is really interesting, is they're grouping up and starting their own consultancies themselves. So they're entrepreneurs in the truest sense of the word. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely. Great, thank you.
I have a question.
Yep.
We start asking
Yeah,
questions?
sure.
All right, I got something out of every one of you. This is really great. I'm so glad to be here, and this is my first experience with the Type Directors Club. I know Steve Heller. He came to our school and he picked some people to go to Houston at the time, and I didn't get to go, which was real disappointment. But the notion of I graduated with my BFA with nothing but theoretical stuff, and that was like we had the first bank of Macs. It was 1987, so they were still slaves. It was like pagement. It was just like so that everything's changed so much since then. And I'm fully, as an instructor, I believe in going back to like that theoretical basis, but because of the terminal degree sort of thing, mine is Masters of Communication, Computers, and Technology and Education. My BFA is Graphic Design. So I'm thinking about, and I'm actually starting to write coursework for design for non-designers, because what I've seen in all the work that you've all shown is this basic, the foundation, and how important that is, especially to teach people who are coming up in business, because now you still have the line length, you still have the lettering, you still have the readability. What makes a good typeface? What makes a bad typeface? And it all comes down, informational graphics, the typography is king in my, as well as grid, as well as and so teaching that is just like, it's coming through in all of this. So my question, first of all, to you was, is the thesis then also collaborative? Because at Teachers College, we did everything teamwork, and it is. It's very
It is very much a collaborative
And
thesis.
my question to you is with the rubric. I thought that was brilliant. So do they have like benchmarks within that rubric? You're stopping them and saying, okay, I want to see the research. Do they turn in a paper for that? Because that ties in that whole thing about being able to write. As a graphic designer, people need to communicate. So you stop them at each one of these things, the research and the.
Yes.
That's great.
Yeah, and I think assessment works really well, because I'm very open with students when we launch a project. I tell them, here is what we're doing, why we're doing it, and here is what you will be measured on, so that there's sort of that leading with the carrot, so they know where to put their effort in a very open way, because I want each student to be able to be successful, so I'm very transparent with what we'll be measuring and when we'll be measuring, and then how. I'll give them the rubric before we start, yes.
And with yours, I thought that's really interesting, because that really helps me a lot with some of the lesson plans, how to stop and assess along the way. I was really interested, like with the Flint posters, what medium they were using. Was this computer generated? I thought that was really like, was it Photoshop? Was it, you know, what were they doing? Are you incorporating, in other words, are you incorporating technology in with the sort of like design that they're doing?
I don't teach the applications. I give them tips on the applications.
So in those two particular
triptych
examples that you showed.
Yeah, the creative suite. I mean, they have to use, they use the creative suite. I always encourage them to work with their hands and make things three-dimensionally if they can. Like
So
that,
do you
those
have them
crushed
do
bottles.
that with the sketching process? Are you like working with them with the sketching process? Because there's a sophistication there that tells me that they're getting something, you know.
Well, that was a
they're getting
junior
good.
assignment. They had 2 weeks to do it. So the first week they came in with sketches for desk crits, and I, located. That's a great idea. Just do that. And then she brought the bottles piece. She just made it. I mean, she sent me a PDF of a sketch, a mini comp, and I said, it's almost there. You should probably shrink everything down to sit on the page a little better. Maybe make 151 in red,
So
stuff like
that
that.
was a 2-week
but
assignment. That's
2-week
pretty-
assignment, yeah.
Really cool. And Ned, with yours, I was really fascinated by this checklist you had. That went through like user-based. That is such a great idea. It's like big to little.
It
fast
seems a little
to thin.
mechanical at times, but it's something that like I said, I just keep coming back to and you can add to it and you can, you know what I mean? It's edible, not edible, but you can edit.
Editable.
Is it available in your books? Because I think that's really handy. Is that something?
Probably, and to
I
be
didn't get a
fair,
chance to- I shot a picture of the rubric, but I didn't get a chance to.
yeah, and how exciting did you make rubrics? I mean, just
Yeah,
curious,
I
who are
am too.
teachers
I
here?
thought
Raise
it
your
was
hands. Yeah, I mean, assessment is the dirty word,
Right.
and
Yeah.
your presentation, I'm just like, well, now I'm kind of psyched about this.
Yeah,
You know,
but that's
it's like,
assessment.
you need to come out and consult.
Yeah.
I have one more question about, how did you constrain them with I thought the monetary system was a really great project, and the way that you applied the actual grid sort of system to that monetary, but also the colors. I thought that palette was quite interesting because how do you work color theory into, to me, that's like a.
Well, I think it's a systems problem because I always pick at 3, right? So, I have this theory, and I don't know if I'm right on this, but it's like doing 1 is really important, but doing 3 means you kind of flush it out. And so it's always either 3 posters or 3. And I just say type, image, form, color, structure, or the building
Color
blocks.
was just, finding color schemes, 30 years down the road, I'm still struggling with the palettes. And so the fact that you had managed to get that color work, I thought that was pretty subtle and nice. So anyway, thanks. This has been really great.
Ned, I'm just wondering, following up on that, you did have the sheet up sort of showing those formal variables of design. Do you give that out to students as like
Yeah,
this sort of
as-
like, here are your tools?
And they all forget it, and they don't probably use it, but
Yeah.
it'll come back the next project brief, and again and again and again.
Uh-huh.
And I think they like you were saying about collaboration. They moan when they see the matrix problems
Yeah.
because it's more, I don't know, it's more scientific in its approach.
Yeah.
It's not creative. But I think cropping and silhouetting and kind of isolation of the sign and making those images more powerful and their meaning to one another, or their formal connections. I think those are all just basic but really important things.
Mhm.
And they don't have to follow that, but it's always there for them.
Mhm.
And it's something that I like to talk about when I'm looking at.
I mean, I think 2 interesting topics that keep coming up are the idea of assessment, which we deal with from micro to macro, and technology, which we also deal with from micro to macro, from the inside the classroom to like how it's looked at from the outside. And I think, so to speak, the matrices are a form of assessment within the classroom, and then
Yeah.
we have assessment from outside or from how we're breaking down the projects to assess.
Mhm. Looks like we have some questions.
I know, I
Yeah.
see.
Do you want to, yeah?
Hi,
Hey.
I'm Holly Tubular, I teach at Kutztown University.
Can everybody hear? Because we do have, no, there are microphones here, I don't know if you.
Can you
okay.
not hear
sorry.
can you not hear the responses? So,
Or we'll talk really,
We'll talk
you
loud.
We'll talk
just
really loud.
Yeah, let us know, okay? Wave at us if you're not hearing us.
You tell me and I'll tell them.
This So I teach at Kutztown University in Pennsylvania, and I teach mostly junior and senior level classes. I teach a professional practice class, which is by far my favorite. It was everything I never learned and didn't have at school, and it's incredibly rewarding to teach a professional practices class. So my question, and the end result of all this assessment and teaching is that the students have a portfolio, and we'll say 99% of them want to actually work in the industry by the time they're done with school. And this is just a constant, I think, conversation that comes up, that how is everybody delivering portfolios in their programs? And I'm just curious if print portfolios are still alive. I'm just researching in terms of trends. Our program is advertising design, graphic design, interactive, and illustration. And so students can pick to code their own site, or they can do a print book and use a templated site. And so I'm just curious what you are all doing in your programs for your undergraduates and how they're delivering a portfolio at the end.
So for anyone who didn't hear the question is about portfolios and how students are being asked to develop portfolios for as their senior year for graduation. Jan?
I had the same question. That you mentioned that there's this large difference in your mind between the kind of portfolio students who presented portfolio reviews versus portfolios for work. And I wanted to know if everyone could kind of address how you see the differences.
That's it.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't get into that because I'm at a community college, and so mostly their portfolios are happening at a senior college.
I would just like to, before we get into hearing from the panelists, I'd just like to, I think this is something that's kind of bubbling to the surface in the discipline a little. There's Peter Lush, who was formerly at Penn State and has just moved on to a new institution. He's working with somebody else on a research project to identify some of these issues and to try and tease out best practices, and hopefully they'll be publishing some of their research in the next year or so. So in addition to what you hear in this room, kind of keep your eye out in various channels for that, because I think there's a lot of people with this exact same question. Debbie, you want to start with that maybe? And then we'll go
Sure. Well, my undergrad students have very different portfolios to the graduate students. My undergraduate students are putting together portfolios very much based on what their portfolio teacher is helping them organize. My class, it's not about anything that is going to go in their portfolio. It's about being able to create a voice that will help them get a job. So for example, in almost everybody's portfolio, in the undergrad students that I teach, they'll have a range of things. And so it's important that they have print publication, and they have a redesign of People magazine, or they have book covers that they've made, or museum installations that they've created. And so there's this requirement that they do these things. Now they think that when they're showing their portfolio, it's important to show that they have a range and that they can do these various things. But if the things that they're designing in their portfolio aren't good, they're not going to get a job. So they're telling me, well, I think it's important that I show that I can do a book cover design. But the book cover design is terrible. So it's not going to help you get a job. So what I'm trying to do is help them cull down what they have. There's no reason for them to have 15, 20 projects in a portfolio. They can have 8, and those 8 should all be of a certain level of excellence. So what I also recommend that they do, and this is something that when I first tell them they're somewhat horrified by, whenever they show their portfolio in that first year or two out of school, when you're still including schoolwork in your portfolio, which at the time they're very attached to, but in 10 years' time they'll be horrified by, and or wax sentimental over, oh, look what I used Penyo, you know. So I ask them, no matter who you're showing your portfolio to, no matter who it is, ask, what one thing would you recommend I take out? Because you tend to kind of know the things that are your most favorite. And I tell them, it doesn't mean that you have to take it out. But if 10 people tell you to take the one thing out, either work on redesigning it in a way that makes more sense to people, figure out a different way of talking about why you believe this is something valuable, or take it out. So that's the undergrads. With the graduate students, they are mostly working on their websites, and then including, because they are working professionals, they're adding things to their portfolio or to their website that augment what they're doing. So if they start the program as designers, but then they're looking to move more into strategy, then we're repositioning their websites. To answer the original question, I think it's really important, but I'm, in my 50s, so I'm a bit of a dinosaur too, to have that paper portfolio. I think there's something really important to have that tactile sort of evidence. But I think that most of the time I'm looking at work that is digital, that it's a PDF or it's something online that is, and I think it's a lot cheaper for them, it's more modular, but I still love paper and making things with my hands, so.
Alex?
So, and this also kind of goes back to the first question of how do you bridge industry into your classroom, and something that I have been equally horrified is the professionalism and just the coaching students need to navigate a professional environment. And so I am building a class that will be the senior capstone class on building a portfolio, but on top of that, building the professional skills needed to navigate a professional environment. Because I follow the model where I'm now full-time faculty, so I'm no longer working full-time in industry, and so I tap those in industry, and I will work with who is hiring junior graphic designers. And the feedback I get time and again is we have a lot of turnover in junior entry-level graphic design positions, not because they're bad designers, but because they're terrible to work with. They can't draft an email, and we can't trust them to not be uncoached working with our client base, and they can't interface with C-level positions because they don't have those soft skills necessary to do that. So we have lots of turnover. So what I've built into my portfolio class is presentation of self and building client relationships and how to write an email. And I'll be open with my students when I get a, hey bro, I'm actually your professor, and here's how to draft communication that isn't a Snapchat or a text message to your good friend, and how to navigate professional relationships in sort of ecosystems that make sense. And also going back to the original question, print versus online portfolio, we do both, and what I talked about students is having something to represent yourself in an environment that makes sense. If you need an online portfolio, if you're applying to a job and they're going to be viewing you on screen. If you're meeting with a freelance client at a coffee shop, there's nothing more awkward than having to sit and have someone scroll through an iPad. Have a physical portfolio to lead that discussion. So I have my students develop both, and have that conversation about what is appropriate when and where, and then how do you deliver that portfolio to whoever is reviewing it.
Any thoughts on portfolio?
Yeah, I mean, for me, whatever works.
Yeah.
I like prints. I like seeing stuff online on a disc. The main concern is that if I tell students they have to.
Can you speak up? I'm pretty sure they can't hear you.
Sure. Okay. Sorry. Having an idea, an intellectual thought that has creative or inventive form brought to it. If they can talk just about that in 12 pieces, I think they probably got the job, because it shows that they can add to a studio and not just be fitting in.
Do you ever hire freelancers to work with you, or do you look at portfolios?
I looked at portfolios, and if they can't verbalize why something looks the way it looks, then it's hard to understand them as moving forward as an employee. And that's my main concern, is just ideas. How to
There
how
are
to
seats up
translate
here for
ideas.
those in the back that can't hear. There are 6 seats up here.
It's cooler up here.
Well, I think they've said everything that's in a more articulate way than I could. But I think we are, at Rutgers, we are both print and digital, and depending upon what makes the most sense. But I think you said something, Scott, that I think is really important. And again, I'm graphic design 1 and 2, so I haven't freshman, sophomore year. They leave with 2 things, a portfolio and a vocabulary. And if they can't explain what they're doing, then they're, trying to get a job with one hand tied behind their back. It's like they have to be able to explain why they did something and how they achieved this. And if you can't do that, then you can't really move forward. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to sort of add to that after having had a couple of discussions about this with folks outside of this room, something that occurred to me that I think is a little bit different that we do, it's an undergraduate program. The vast majority of our students are first generation to college, and they don't come from really visually sophisticated backgrounds to start. So where they come from and where they have to get in 4 years, there's a lot that we have to go a long way together. And so, one of the things that we've found is that more structure is almost always better. And so this is for undergrads. We've really started pushing documentation in the portfolio back into all the way from sophomore year on, so that it's not something you do at the end. Every single project in every single one of my classes, documentation of that project, as in is the portfolio, how it's going to look in the portfolio, is part of that grade right from sophomore year on. And we don't have time, because it's not a portfolio class, to make an online portfolio as sophomores, but they just put it up onto Behance, so that when somebody comes along, a lot of them are from the New York City metro area, when, often they'll have 3 internships before they graduate, or 2 internships before they graduate. So somebody, if there's an opportunity for them to go in an internship interview, summer, sophomore year, they're not like scrambling to put stuff together, or where was that little hard drive that failed, in week 8, or all of that. They just are, it's not perfect, but they have something up to show. And then, in senior year, we transitioned into a more formal portfolio, which in these days is largely digital, though if somebody has a beautiful hand-done piece, there's no reason somebody can't bring that. But I think bringing the whole idea of portfolio and that it's not about whether you're showing it in the art director's club, it's about showing it to somebody who might hire you, back into the younger level classes has really helped tremendously, because then there's not the scramble senior year.
I think it also gives them a feeling of accomplishment. When they see something up on Behance that they made, it really connects to them. They're like, wow, I made that and it's up there and it looks real.
Yeah, and they get a few likes, or somebody emails them. I mean, it's just, it makes it a little more tangible than that rubric, where it's just the grade at the end, and it seems subjective to whatever that particular faculty decided
Also,
to do.
I encourage my students to create a blog.
Yeah.
Not a Facebook page, a
Yeah.
blog,
Yeah.
where they can actually write
That's
and
great.
pull things in from outside, anything really, not just even design, but critical writing, something outside, another activity, where they can just practice typing what that has to do with what they're working on right now. And I think it's really useful for students, especially seniors, to have a running blog, because they can point to the blog to an potential employer and say, hey, this is something in addition that I do that says I care about design and I can write.
Yeah, guide writing is huge.
I think we have some more questions.
So I can see everybody.
I'm not an educator and I'm not a designer. I run a small boutique agency, and I'm here because I need to crack the code of why these junior designers are failing to work with industry. I often get projects where I need freelance designers, and it's a perfect place to help them grow their portfolio and learn how to, be with people. The themes I see is time management. You don't know how many hours something takes to make. It's a really hard thing for me to figure out how to do the project. So that's super important. Deadlines, please do not give extensions on deadlines. I'm begging all of the educators. It doesn't work in real life, and they should get the practice of feeling the F if they can't deliver on time. It drives me incredibly insane. And the professional communication, that too, you might get the job, I might want to bring you on full time, but you're not going to advance because I'm not going to put you in front of a client. Maybe I can handle the unprofessional communication internally, we'll work on it, mentorship, blah, blah, blah. There's no way I'm letting you near a client. Absolutely not. The other thing I would just like to comment, and I'd like to hear particularly about this, is the writing part is really important. It was interesting to hear how that's a part of the curriculum and how you all have that in, are thinking of that in the training. What I find is when you ask students to write, when you ask anyone to write, it starts to organize their thoughts. And I would, not just the long form, the short form. Like, if you can get students writing short forms where they have to really distill that, it'll help them in those conference rooms when the client says, I don't get this. They're not it's not essay time. It's, you have to be able to identify that specific issue and be open about, well, maybe the client just doesn't like it, maybe they're wrong, and that's going to be okay because they're writing the check. So, I'm curious. So my question, my speech is over, but my question, do you specifically focus on writing, and what are they asked to write about? I'm curious about that. Thanks.
Who wants to start out with, do you focus on writing?
I can just say that we have a writing across the curriculum committee, and there are certain classes that are designated as writing intensive, and I think it's okay, but it's not nearly as efficient and robust as it should be. And I find I'm not a particularly strong writer myself. I think, believe it or not, email has helped me out. I've become stronger over the years. So I can sympathize, but yeah, it's, I teach a seminar class and a history class, and they both do papers for those classes. And there are times where I have to sit down with the student for an extended period of time, like over a month, and meet with them and talk about and clarify and understand. It's really difficult. Rutgers Newark is a really diverse student population, both in their experiences and their education level and stuff, and you have some really great students who are here tonight, and then you have some other ones that, you know, are really struggling. And I'd love to say that, you know, everybody is mentored or sufficiently helped, but they're not. And I sleep really well at night knowing that the grade I'm giving is the appropriate grade for what they've done. It's like not everybody can be excellent, you know, and that's the way it is. But I also come off as a bitter old man, you know. In my day, 6 miles up in
Well, design programs have a hard time doing this because universities that have design programs in them, students tend to be a little bit more research oriented. They have serious classes that they have to kick ass on to write papers, and they come into design and they're more apt to and more willing to put that time in. And design schools, I know they're trying to push. I know Pratt is really pushing the liberal arts and the humanities a little further so that we can have more well-rounded students. But it's, I mean, in writing and design are the same. They're like sister brother. I mean, when, you know, I tell students I could, writing that textbook, I'd like spend an entire day writing like one paragraph, and then the editor would just go whoop, you know? And I call it cutting the fat, you know. And it's like, so you have to be succinct and get to the point and not vary into 5 different things. Just like when they create a design, I tell them just 2-3 sentences max that you can explain what your idea is about. If it's more than that, you're going off on tangents, like you would be writing a 1,000-word paper or a 1,000-word essay and talking about 50 things instead of just one thing. So, it bleeds off that way into students, but I can't, and I get them to write on their blogs about their work. It's like pulling teeth. But I tell them that it's important. You know, when you get out, you're gonna be forced to write briefs and correspond with clients, and it's part of it. And don't forget, you know. And that's the best I can do. I can't force it on them. And I don't have they can take an elective writing class, but not all of them do in our design school. But they have to in a university.
Alex, can we assess our way out of this problem?
Always. You can assess your way. You can, as long as you have a miserable outcome, we can assess our way out.
No, the outcome's not so important. We have to assess all the way along.
Yes, all the way along. You can assess on many different levels. But to writing, so I'm in a liberal arts university, and my greatest, I think, ally and greatest asset is the art historians in my program. And I'm very open. We have a faculty advising model, so all our majors have to meet with our faculty in their programs. And I talk to them, and I'm very open that do not view your art history courses as hoops you have to jump through to earn a degree. This is your great opportunity to understand context, because if you don't understand the world you're designing for and the visual history that we have, how are you going to be a relevant and engaged designer? But more importantly, to really embrace the writing that comes with our art history courses. So as students come in and I kind of take my art history course, I give them a little pep talk that this is really important and really exciting, and here's why it's relevant and not just a hoop you're jumping through. And then also I do little writing assignments. One of my favorite things to do for my junior level students is we talk about how tidy their education has been to date, where they get this handout and this form, and this is sort of where assessment can fail because it's very, very tidy. And I will give them a verbal project and not give them any sort of tangible handout sheet. And what they have to do before they can start the project is write me a professional email that's sort of a design brief, but their understanding, so we can have a shared understanding of what it is we're going to be doing for the next few weeks. And we talk about that sort of real life, living writing, because I think it's very important. And I'll also do the shameless. If I get a terrible email, I will correct it, email it back to them, and then they can try again. So.
Debbie, do you have any? Is this sort of in the range of what you find both with particularly with undergraduates in terms of lack of preparedness and?
Oh God. Yeah. And in grad school, right, you probably have a lot of writing in your program.
Well, there's a lot of writing in the graduate program, but ironically, the hardest project for them to wrap their heads around, and something that we see them struggle with every year, is the writing of a creative brief. And what are the things that need to go into a creative brief, and they get all over the place. So yes, but my graduate students are all working, or most of them have been working, so they have a somewhat better sense of how to write. But in the thesis, the big issue that a lot of them have, and this is both grad and undergrad, is presenting. And the reliance on notes or presentation notes in a PowerPoint program, for example. So we don't allow any notes to be used at all in thesis. There, and that terrifies them. That's probably the scariest thing, is that they have to get up on stage and defend their ideas without notes, because they have to know what they're talking about, but the undergrads, they have to be able to craft a mission statement, to be able to answer the question, what do you want to do when you graduate? And that mission statement, that intention, is also really difficult for them. And we hear a lot about this, get a seat at the table stuff. But my big question is, what are you going to say when you're at the table? You're just going to listen and take notes? So that's the biggest issue. But I have a question. I have a question for the panel. I have a question for the audience. Devices. They are so addicted to their phones. Even with, if I catch you with your phone, you will be asked to leave the classroom. If your phone goes off in the classroom, I will take the phone from you. They can't help themselves. They go to the bathroom. They try to sneak it under. I mean, we've all done that ourselves, so we know what they're doing. How are you combating this? Because, like Ned said, I end up feeling like the dragon lady with, if I catch you with your phone more than 3 times, you will not be allowed to come back to the class.
Sometimes they're happy to give them away. They actually are happy to have a break from it. I have to say,
I
sometimes
don't
my
have
students.
any students.
I've never met that student.
I do.
I don't have any.
They actually
Never
are glad
have.
to give it to me because they
Never
can't
have.
stop. They literally can't
They
stop.
are addicted. And then 3 times, I teach my classes are 2.5 hours. So how many times do you have to go to the bathroom? How many times should we let them go to the bathroom? So what are you all doing?
I mean, I definitely think anyone who's an educator in this room is probably feeling this. I know I haven't taken this step, but this semester I want to start at the beginning of next semester. I heard from somebody at another event we were at that they just had a box at the front of the room, and that if you start at the beginning of the semester and everybody puts their phone in,
Yeah.
it's really, really, and people have said it's really, really successful. I had thought that I was making headway, and then have had so many issues in the last month that I thought, why keep fighting that battle? Maybe just go to that mode. But I don't know. Does anyone else have any?
I have a 4-year-old, so I kind of understand that you have to repeat things again and again. And I am the nasty guy. It's like, turn them off or I'm going to throw them out the window.
Yeah.
And I have the luxury of being rather tall, not as tall as Alex, but tall. and I kind of look intimidating, although I'm thinking, not at all. But it's
There's
like,
nothing
guys,
I can do about that.
Yeah, right.
my head turns red. It's like, put the phones down.
Yeah.
And I think so I have them for, freshman, sophomore year, and then they're probably using them right away as soon as they get out of my class. I don't know, but in my class, it's not really a problem after the first.
Yeah. Anyone else have any
Or maybe I think.
headway that you've made, or are you just fighting the good fight with all the rest of it?
With phones, they don't. I let them be there.
Really?
Yes, but I am we have relatively small classes, and I am very comfortable as I'm calling someone out and the culture shame them into doing it. I am also very fine, because it is often, if someone's head's down, I will finish saying something, they will ask me a question, and I will just answer with, if you weren't on your phone, I literally just said that. So I'm very open with that dialogue. And when I do shift, I also use it to my benefit, because I talk about that you have this instant, limitless access to information. You no longer can tell me you're uninformed. So I will oftentimes turn it on them and say, you don't know that. It's right there. Here's how we will find it. And then I also will have them do sort of developing this idea file where you have instant access to be able to record visual information. And I talk about in my classes that we are so lucky in what we're doing that visual, our research, you just have to walk outside and you have access to it. So I'll oftentimes just turn it on them, but then shame and embarrass them when it suits me. So
We have
that's
a sore arm happening back there.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'm also really intrigued with the question about digital technologies in the classroom, and hearing what you're talking about, having the box in the classroom reminds me of my daughter, my 15-year-old daughter, whose favorite class is science, and the science teacher has a bunch of, it's a shoe rack in the back of the class, and the students all have to leave their cell phone in there when they're coming in. And my daughter says that she loves that. I don't know why, but she got to sleep with everybody else.
That's awesome.
But there is also a bigger question here that we're kind of waltzing around, which is the issue of writing, which I do believe also is cut into and becoming weaker, of course, as we're moving into the social media age. And just to go back to the previous issue when we were talking about writing as well, I do want to say that there is a structural or a curricular problem, to your point, because it actually, especially in art schools, I'm actually the art historian, design historian, but I have to say that it's really hard to insert any of those sorts of classes into what are usually really, really structured curricula, and it's usually a long fight just to even get a history class in, let alone something, where there would be a kind of writing intensive course. So I think that these are issues that are kind of buzzing around in places like NASAD, but it's worth us having rigorous discussions and thinking about this from the point of view of what employers are looking for and realizing how important it is to be good visual communicators, and you have to deliver this in a curriculum that acknowledges that too. So I do that.
Yeah, I think it's excellent the sort of to have somebody. I thank you for coming in and sort of taking us to task, because how we
Yell at you.
No, absolutely not.
We deserve
sort of this is the mark of our success, is the student success, and where there's holes, it's really important for us to get that feedback as well, and to think about also. I think one of the things that occurred to me was, we have a lot of art history classes and we have a lot of writing classes because we're a university, but students can't even transfer their color theory skills or their foundation design skills sometimes to their design projects. The idea that they're transferring that skill that they learned writing that paper for their English Lit class into writing the email to you you know, whether or not we think that should happen, if that's not happening, maybe we need to help bridge that gap.
Right, and I think maybe if we can't get those classes in curriculum, we can teach it in our classes, writing creative briefs. We're not reinventing the wheel here, like we can teach students how to do this, how to have better presentation skills. Like these are teachable skills. And I think maybe they don't have, maybe it's not isolated class, but I do think it's important that we add those to our classes from freshmen on, because absolutely, like, writing is intimidating. There's no question. And writing an art history paper is not the same as writing a design brief or a short 2-sentence, 3-sentence, mission statement. Like,
Well, and we talked about it, about the journals. It was like pulling teeth to get people to contribute. Like, please, we write about, and in some cases it kind of boiled down to we would publish an interview because they didn't want to write, and I don't know if this is true or not, but my mom's education was much better than my education, and I just see a bigger issue with education in general being inferior to what it's been in the past, and I'm complicit in that. I'm part of that, but I think trying to, to your point about writing, trying to, and what you said about bringing it in all the time, try to bring it in as much as possible, because you only get better by doing.
It becomes less scary.
Yeah.
Do we have a couple other? Yeah, absolutely.
Probably mainly for Debbie, but anybody's input. Alright, so some of the first writing that I encountered, kind of even describing what branding was, while I was just enjoying making a little money on the side for creative projects, it was critical. It was Fences and Windows by Naomi Klein. And I kind of liked it, and I read a lot of her other stuff. Earlier in one of the interviews in Debbie's book, there's a really wonderful defense of branding, what branding is. The fact that critics of branding are using the tools of branding to get their names and their faces and their ideas out there. And I kind of wonder, I guess, generally, how often you guys find yourselves defending what you do, like me. And Debbie, what are we doing to prepare people to defend it and kind of explain that people who do branding, who do this just for corporations and everything, contributions to the community that aren't, Ms. Klein's critique has its limitations.
Yeah, I mean, I really admire Naomi Klein a lot, and I think a lot of what she says is really brilliant. I mean, I've been attacked for working in branding. In 2003 on Speak Up, the blog Speak Up, I was called a she-devil. Truly. But I think that the world has changed a lot in the last 14, 15 years. And I think that I still think that for many, many reasons, branding is considered a bad word.
Yeah.
But what I'm seeing now, and this is my most current sort of treatise on what's happening in branding, aside from what I talked about, and thank you for reading that and being so astute about that particular part about the detractors of branding are using the very tenets of branding that they so vocally disdain in the way that they communicate in their websites and their logos and so forth. I mean, the irony is that the no logo is a logo. But what I see happening now, and what I feel is the most optimistic defense of the discipline, is that it's finally democratized. And we've seen this happen in the last really 2 years, not even 2 years. The first evidence of it, the first mainstream global evidence of it, was after the terrorism attack in Nice, when we saw the logo that was created by the mashup of the Eiffel Tower and the peace sign. Now, for those of us in branding, we know that all of these symbols are brands. Brian Collins and Massimo Vignelli have both been talking for years about the design of the crucifix. So, they've been talking about this for a really long time. but it's become democratized in that this person, you know, made this identity, this, and that was a symbol. And we've seen it in other lesser extents, but still broadly in the use of the rainbow flag as part of our profile picture on Facebook. And then we saw it with the hashtags. Black Lives Matter is now very much, now when I see something as a brand, I mean it's a symbol for a specific way of thinking about something.
Differentiation.
Yes, deliberate differentiation. That's the way I define branding, is deliberate differentiation. So we've used this now, these hashtags, to signify meaning. It's meaning manufacture. But what I think is the most powerful brand that's been launched in the last maybe 100 years is the pink pussy hat.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a color, it's a shape, it's something that we're all wearing, it's something that signifies meaning and values. And that's by and created for the person that is in this tribe. And so there's no P&L, there's no marketplace position, there's no shelf slotting, there's no return on the investment. It's just this creation, this meaning that is embedded in this thing that has become its own brand. So that gives me a great deal of hope that it's sort of this now, I mean, it's gonna sound a little cheesy, somewhat corny, but it's becoming a manifestation of the human spirit to create these symbols that signify tribes, that signify what you believe in. And that's pretty meaningful. So I feel good about that, and that's how I defend it now.
But we also have a president that ran on his own brand, created over, and Naomi Klein, I went to her lecture at the corporate union recently, and he spent decades working on his brand, and the brand wound up being it's a very hollow brand, but people see it as a brand, and he throws in patriotism, and people buy it. And so, according to Naomi Klein, she's right, brands can be very evil as well.
No, I disagree. It's not the brands that are evil. These brands don't exist as with DNA and souls and blood. It's the people that are the evil ones. It's not brands, and it's not corporations. It's the people that work in the brands and the corporations that are evil and have bad intent. A brand is only able to do what it is directed to do by a person.
Well, it's like guns don't kill people. People kill people. We still have a president who's a hollow brand, and he manipulated the brand to convince people to.
Branding is powerful.
It's
There's no
powerful,
question.
and it could be used for evil ways, and it could be used for positive ways. And I think we all have to be careful of that.
I think so. This leads maybe sort of my question. I'm really interested in how do you teach self-assessment? I think this conversation around branding is a window into that. Thinking about there's never enough time in the class period or semester or a curriculum or a degree program, right? That you have a year to, right? It's obscene and absurd how little time you have students. So I was wondering if you guys have figured out or teasing at a way. I think self-assessment is probably a tool that gets them to move forward, gets them to realize that they're doing something wrong or they're doing something right, and to articulate that. I think that maybe gets at some of the concerns about not being able to operate in the workplace. Just wondering if you guys
It's also one of the
teach
most.
that,
It's
or
also
how you teach that.
Yeah, it's also one of the most important things you can teach, because you can't continue to stay in school forever, right? So when we talk about sort of mimicking the professional environment, in some ways that's a fallacy, because you don't really go out and have this experience of the critique and all of this feedback. I mean, our students certainly say that's one of the things that they miss. So without self-assessment, to your point, if you can't take that on into your career, then you're really in deep trouble in some ways. So
I think it has to do with time management, all those skill sets that students need to learn. Otherwise, they don't have time management when they get on the job, because they have to know when to do something, when it's done,
right,
when to turn it over.
right, when good is good enough. Do you guys have any thoughts on teaching self-assessment?
Or instilling it, maybe it's just part of built into something.
I don't know if this is an answer, and again, I'm just going to come off I'm not the most talented and I'm not the smartest, but I will be damned if anybody's going to outwork me. And I think that's That's it. You know, your question about writing, excuse me. I only got better by writing more. You know, it's like there's a long list of deficiencies that I have, but I'm not going to be outworked. And at the end of the day, it's like, you know, the students, like, you know, you can be really super talented, you can be very articulate, and if you don't have a work ethic, it's all for naught. You know, how many things do we have to teach in a 3 or 4 year period? And you know, but when it comes down to it, the work ethic is probably the most important to me. It doesn't, and I'm lucky enough that I have faculty members that are very different than I am, so they get good, bad, different kind of things. But I would say work ethic.
Well, anybody who teaches, they know that they want the students to be the same kinds of students that they were when they were a student. That's why they're teaching. And
it doesn't always work out that way,
yeah,
right?
it's like maybe 20% of the class is like that. So, but you know, we're creating this design utopia in class too. So, yes, and time frame and deadlines are part of it, but also the design utopia is to get them to love design, to get that touch and that feel. And so there's a fine line between being hardcore, work, deadlines, be a good employee, and also, you know, feeding your soul and liking what you do and building a backstory into your work is just as important. Otherwise, they're going to be in the field for 5 years and leave because, you know, they're just fed up with it. They don't know how to be a perpetual student. So I think it's a red flag to, you know, to just treat it like, you know, work will make you free. Kind of.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that I love what I do, and what I do I take very seriously. And that can be fun, you know. I mean, that can be, it doesn't, but I take fun seriously, or I take what I do seriously, and that, you know, you can't half-ass it and believe that you're going to achieve all these things. It's just, hard work is.
Well, that's true.
I don't know.
Alex, do you have?
Well, you said assessment, which
Yeah.
is that's I never thought of cares. But what I think we as educators can do is, this is something I think a lot about, is create a culture where failure isn't a bad thing. Because if you create an environment where, and I talk to my students about this, like, you're not going to lose your job in my class. So now is the time to experiment and fail, and then we can analyze that failure so that when you are in an environment where you are going to lose your livelihood, you don't make whatever that mistake is. And I think that you can develop projects where, and students will come in and their head will be down, like, oh, it didn't go well, and I say, wonderful. Why didn't it go well? And why aren't you where you need to be at this point? And then we can talk openly about time mismanagement or not doing the appropriate back-end research, and that's where that self-assessment piece can come in. Because yes, it feels wonderful to be successful, but I learn the most from my blunders. And so can we as educators create an environment where the student can make a mistake and it won't derail them, and we can learn from that, and then walk them through that very scary process of looking at this failure and what did you learn from, so you can map yourself to future success.
And Debbie, you said you work mostly in groups in the graduate program, and I think groups is really a forum for assessment, self-assessment, peer assessment.
Yes and no, and we're still a young program. We're only in our 8th year, and I've learned a lot because, sort of like Ned, I sort of feel like I expect that the students are going to work hard because that's what I would want to do. And it's a 10.5-month program, and why wouldn't you want to work as hard as possible? But not everybody does.
Right.
And that's sort of heartbreaking in a lot of ways. But I started the program with this notion that people are going to be there because they want to be there and learn, and we decided to make it a pass-fail program. And in most cases, it works really well. But it doesn't always, and so we've had to put, and I loved your rubric, and I kind of want to learn more about it offline, but we started a meets expectations, beats expectations, below expectations, etc. And if anybody is not meeting the expectations, and so we are evaluating everybody midway through each semester, and so we can actually put people on a program to either get them up to speed or they have to leave the program. because I don't want to be putting people out in the industry that don't deserve to have a master's degree, say they have a master's degree, just because I don't want to hurt somebody's feelings because they're not doing the work and so forth. I mean, it's very hard for me to give failing grades. Then we tried something really interesting, which I'll share with you all. So we have groups. Every semester there's a group. And we had been assigning all the groups all the time. We had the fall semester, spring semester, thesis semester. And we would, I think everybody has seen, there are archetypes. There's the overachiever student and the skeptical student and the lazy student, and you have these archetypes of what students are and how they operate. And I found that there's repetitive patterns to the way certain students are and the struggles that you have with certain kinds of students. And we found that we were hiding them in groups. So like every group would have somebody that could be like this. And then the other members of the group are having to make up for that and compensate for that. So we were trying to figure out how do we deal with this? So we tried 2 years ago thesis as self-selection.
Mm-hmm.
And year one it worked really well. And what ends up happening is that the people that aren't selected finally have to confront the fact that they have developmental issues that they need to work on.
Mm-hmm.
And the first year it worked well. But because the students can communicate year on year, that group told the next year's students what was coming. And it was like the Hunger Games. And people started positioning and operating themselves in January for the self-select groups that were going to be created in May.
Survivor.
Yeah, Survivor. So we disbanded that. But it was a really, if there were this sort of secrecy around it, and people weren't positioning and positing through the second semester, it was a really interesting way for the students to recognize what we were telling them about their developmental issues as actual fact, and not just, well, that teacher is hard and she doesn't like me. But unfortunately, it's not a bubble, so we couldn't continue to do that. But it's still the hardest part of, I was talking to Harmit Esslinger in one of my interviews with him, and I asked him what was the hardest part of his practice, and he said that the hardest part of the practice is the practice, is actually the business of the business. And I think the hardest part of teaching is not actually the teaching, but the changing of the, how do we influence these students not to just learn things, but to learn some things about themselves. That's the hardest thing, I think.
Yeah, I also just say that I think a really nuts and bolts, just practical approach to self-assessment is this idea of groups. So you can always see something in somebody else more easily than you can see it in yourself. So by having students critique each other's work and have that be a deliverable where they actually have to provide that feedback, I mean, my experience is that students get much better over time at assessing their own work if they have much more time having had to assess other people's work towards really specific objectives. And then they're eventually able to take those same objectives and apply it to their own work. And also, and particularly that's the case if that assessment of others' work also involves making the other person kill one of their ideas, I mean, where there's really actionable things that they're looking to do. I think we have the benefit, because we have a small program, of seeing the same students over time. And so that, I would say, is the number one way that they get better at self-assessment, is practicing self-assessment on somebody else, because it's almost always very difficult to start on yourself.
I think we've built that into all of our classes, and they see that, because a lot of times they'll be reluctant to criticize someone else's work because they don't want them to have to do more work.
Right.
But when they see in the long run that it's going to make better work, and they really start to understand the whole mechanics of the language,
Yeah.
I do
I have
think
a good process that I use, which I think I am riffing off of it from a Czech Republic designer, but he referred to it as move it over. So usually I'm showing my work, or I'm up, my work is on the wall or projected, and the student that just showed his or her work has to now spend 5 minutes critiquing my work before I even come in as the creative director. And it's just to keep move it over. And I found that that's a really helpful, it gets them to learn the language, to break something down in terms of its form or its idea or the total concept.
Yep. Yeah, I also have students present each other's work. So they have to be the creative director or art director and present the other person's work as though that person was like the junior designer whose work they're presenting. And that's always very, that's always very exciting and fun. But they really, after the first couple times, they're like, oh, I kind of liked doing that. So
you don't have the same ownership.
Exactly.
So you can be more objective about it.
Did you have a question? I saw your hand up.
I just wanted to add, let me introduce myself.
Please.
My name's Francisco.
Can you stand, because it's hard for us to see in the back? Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to introduce myself real quick. My name is Francisco. I am a Rutgers student. I was one of the students of NIJU. I would like to say that I strongly believe what you mentioned, that students have that little clique, or students are, they sign being in certain groups. I strongly believe that if students were taken out of their comfort zone, you're pushing them to expose themselves of who they are as individuals. Because there's certain points where I was taken out of my comfort zone, like from arts, culture, media classes, art ACMs, or graphic design 1, 2, 3. For good example, I have a flaw of being a leader. I really don't like being a leader. And when I was put into that situation, it forced me to adapt to have that characteristic of being a leader. Contacting my classmates, telling them, hey, we're going to do a video conference. If no one can make it, just let us know. If you could even get 1 hour of your time, trying to find a way to make things work. As a start off, it was terrible start. But at the end result, it showed some of the flaws that I had. And I believe, again, that if classes were taught where it was a way that they could be taken out of their comfort zone, but yet without the risk, the high risk feeling of having to struggle to make up work for others, and have the evaluation sheets, I feel like that also is a strong point at which those two will be merged. So.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's great to hear from somebody who's a former student but still remembers being
Still a student.
Still a student. So
I'm
that's
going to
good.
fail you, by the way.
Yeah, one more question, and that's you, ma'am.
My question is, I just read an article from Tobias von Schneider about asking stupid questions, which really hit me because I didn't finish here in the States, I finished in Serbia, and while I was in undergraduate school, I was terrified to ask any questions at all in a class or a lecture because I was afraid I was going to sound stupid. And then I started working, and I was afraid to ask questions. Clients, my managers, whatever, and which is wrong because some people just write terrible briefs, and you need to ask questions. And after maybe my third project when I failed, I was like, that's because I didn't ask questions. And then that's when I learned. And then in graduate school, my professor, I still didn't ask questions in classes or lectures. My professor asked me to do a lecture to younger students. And I did, and it was fun. And people asked questions, and there were no stupid questions. Even basic ones, how did you feel while you were working there? Which is, some people just want to know, and it's okay to ask. So my question is, do you encourage your students to ask questions? Do you believe if there are stupid questions at all?
Do
we have a
encourage
class on questions.
You,
on asking questions, where people are asked to ask questions. It's not about answers; it's about questions. So, bravo that you've been able to look at that and ask a question.
Yeah, we appreciate you asking a question today. That shows. That's great.
Because I think professors think, or students think, well, if I don't ask any questions, then the professor will think that I'm a good student, I'm a complacent student, I get everything. And to a professor, the good student is the one who asks questions, and it's just the opposite of what the students think it's supposed to be.
And
but I disagree. I mean, there are stupid questions. I mean, it's just you can't be afraid to ask them. You have to push the fear aside And yeah, that's putting yourself out there. There are stupid ideas, there are stupid questions, but you deal with them. You don't just push them aside. I have a this new paradigm that we're dealing with because of all this disruption in education. I mean, I tell my students, I don't care. Bring your phones in. I really don't give a shit. When I bring up a name like Pierre Bernard, I want them to look it up. If a presenter is giving a lecture and I see somebody like this and not even listening to what they're saying or seeing any of the work, I used to walk over and just, tap them on the shoulder. Now I've been told we're not allowed to touch students at all. So the best I can do is give them an evil glare. I can't even I can't touch anything. But to me, that's part of the new paradigm. Is that we have to accept this. This is the technology. It's not going away. And I think if it's used for a benefit, then it's great. I don't like the idea of excluding something that's so prevalent in our culture today.
But I think it dilutes attention, and yes, they can also ask about Pierre Bernard, and if they don't know and you're talking about it, or if you think that they might not know, then you can also ask. I mean, there are times where I'll bring something up and I'll say, does everybody know about Tibor Kalman? And not everybody knows about Tibor Kalman. I don't want them to start looking up Tibor Kalman while I'm talking, because then they're not paying attention to everything else that's happening. So I do have issues with attention, and that's really the I think that these devices sort of depopulate social space, and if we're allowing for people to become isolationists in that space while they're in groups, so while they're in the classroom, then it becomes not only disrespectful to me, it becomes disrespectful to the other students that are around them witnessing that they're doing that. And that's the big issue for me.
Yeah, I think part of the problem for me is that attention of devices and their inability to prioritize information and what information is important in that moment, be it social information or information they're getting. A student in class will be on their phone and I'll be like, put the phone down. He said, it's my mother's birthday. I'm like, it's your mother's birthday, it's graphic design. Like, what's more important?
But it's the whole day. You have the whole day.
Right. And so they're like, oh yeah, right, I guess graphic design. Like, right now, that is more important to me.
Right. But Liz, you know what? And I think this is the key, and I think that's absolutely right, is that if it were just looking up Pierre Bernard, that might be okay. But show me a student that can just do that and not check Instagram or answer a text or send a selfie.
Yeah.
And
I could go on
say,
all day
okay,
about
just look up Pierre
devices.
Bernard and Tibor Kalman while you're at it. But,
No, they wouldn't think to do that with it.
Your question about questions, I remember in undergrad getting a brief from a professor, and the class was silent. And I thought, all these guys and girls, they know what's going on, and I'm such an idiot. And I just said, what is this? And everybody started laughing because everybody was as confused as I was. And I think there are stupid questions, but I think questions are hugely important, and sometimes you purposely withhold information so that it starts, a conversation. But if you're paying attention and you're not on your cell phone, you can think of some really good questions that, the device thing is.
I have an issue with this sort of stupid word. I think that
it's
there
a
might
bad
be,
word.
maybe there are
Scott.
dumb questions in sort of day-to-day life, but I would have a really, really hard time judging a question that my students are asking unless they're not paying attention.
Well, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think that there are maybe just sometimes too many questions. And I've felt it both professionally and in classroom situations. Sometimes you just need to stop asking questions and figure out the answers or figure out a solution. I think a lot of times I think students just keep asking the question because they're like,
to hear themselves talk.
or that you're going to answer like every single step of the way for them.
So you
like,
tell them
come
what to
on, like let's start figuring this out. And I think I've seen it in professional places too. It's like you can't answer every question. You really have to start figuring out, especially when you're working with technical things. Like if you, I found this as a graphic designer, like I got to sort out the technical by myself a lot of the times because too many questions, there's nobody there to answer them. It's just
I think
enough with the questions.
I think that will have to be the last question. And We do have some sparkling water and
Some wine.
in the back.
And some glasses.
And we invite everybody who isn't questioned out or design education out for the day to stick around, introduce yourself to the panelists and to those of us from AIGA New York and Design Incubation. You're trying to get in another question?
I'm cool with more questions.
It's simple.
One more question.
It's super simple. Alex, could you make your rubric available?
Ah.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Are you gonna write a book now, like assessment?
Awesome assessment.
Alex does assessment.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Really
But
good.
let's continue the conversation just a little more organically. And I hope you guys stick around and hang out for a little while. And thank you for being such a wonderful, engaged audience.
Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you to the